People who've been through hard phases in life often develop a curious ability. They keep functioning even when they shouldn't have to. They keep making decisions, solving problems, keeping life together, even while internally something never fully rests. They notice details others miss. They anticipate conflicts. They sense shifts in the air before anything actually happens. From the outside, this looks like maturity. On the inside, it's often quiet exhaustion. There's a specific difficulty in simply trusting that things will hold, in staying present without calculating the next impact, and accepting care without preparing for its withdrawal. What's curious is that these reactions aren't usually felt as consequences of past experiences. They're experienced as personality traits, as if they were natural, inevitable, permanent, but they're not random. Certain experiences reorganize the way we perceive safety, closeness, and rest. They don't stay in the past as memories. They start operating as criteria, as filters, as automatic responses. This video isn't about difficult events, it's about what they silently change. Decisions, relationships, internal limits. And when this logic becomes visible, a lot of what once felt confusing starts to take shape. After the difficult phase passes, many things return to normal. Routines reorganize, life moves forward. But internally, not everything keeps pace. Some responses remain active even when they're no longer needed. People who've been through hard periods, whatever their nature, learn to operate in a state of readiness. This isn't conscious, it's a mode of functioning. The body reacts quickly, the mind seeks control, attention rarely fully relaxes. This helps under pressure, but it comes at a cost when the pressure is gone. One of the first areas where this shows up is in the relationship with rest. Relaxing starts to feel unfamiliar. Silence feels uncomfortable. Doing nothing can feel like waste or risk. Even in safe moments, there's a sense that you need to be prepared for the next problem, even when none is in sight. These people also tend to take on responsibility too early. They fix things. They hold things together. They carry weight. Asking for help feels unnecessary or uncomfortable, not because they don't trust others, but because they learned that relying on someone can fail. So they do it themselves. They always have. In relationships, this shows up as caution, not an obvious one, but an internal reserve. A quiet calculation about how far to go, how much to reveal, how much to expect. Getting close requires constant attention. Full surrender feels imprudent even when the bond is good. What's curious is that none of this is usually seen as a problem. On the contrary, it's often praised. People call them mature, strong, grounded, and they learn to identify with that. They take these traits on as identity. But at some point, a kind of fatigue appears, one that's hard to explain. A weariness that doesn't come from overwork, but from constant vigilance, from never fully lowering the guard, from always being one step ahead of what could go wrong. This exhaustion isn't dramatic. It seeps into daily life, into small irritations, into difficulty trusting the natural flow of things, into a persistent feeling that resting too much is dangerous. What few people realize is that this way of functioning didn't arise by chance. It was useful. It protected. It kept things standing when it had to. But what protects in one moment can limit in another. And understanding where that line begins to form changes how these people see themselves, not as flawed, but as adapted to contexts that no longer exist in the same way. Over time, this way of functioning starts to influence choices that at first glance seem unrelated to the past. Career decisions, relationships, personal boundaries, everything passes through an invisible filter, minimizing emotional risk. People who've been through difficult experiences tend to prefer predictable paths, not necessarily easier ones, but more controllable ones. They feel more comfortable when they know what to expect, when they can anticipate scenarios, when they have some room to maneuver. Surprises, even positive ones, can feel unsettling. This shows up in how they approach opportunities. Before saying yes to something new, they assess the hidden cost. They think about what could go wrong, what might demand too much, what could slip out of control. Many opportunities are turned down not because of lack of interest, but because of excessive caution. In relationships, the same logic applies. Connection happens, but with internal breaks. There is affection, there is interest, there is exchange. What's missing is a full sense of safety to lean into it. These people stay available, but rarely vulnerable. They show strength where they wish they could show rest. This creates a quiet contradiction. They long for closeness, but feel threatened by it. They want connection, yet pull back when it starts to require real surrender. The result is often a relational life that functions, but lacks spontaneity. Another important aspect is the relationship with mistakes. For those who've lived through hard phases, mistakes were rarely neutral. They had consequences. They came with costs. They had impact. Because of that, mistakes become something to avoid intensely. There's a constant effort to do everything the right way, even when there are no clear rules. This drive to get things right generates internal tension. The person pressures themselves more than they realize. They revisit decisions repeatedly. They struggle to simply experiment. The fear isn't the mistake itself, but what the mistake might trigger. The body plays a role in this too. Constant vigilance maintains a level of tension that becomes habitual. Even in calm situations, there's a state of readiness. Rest is never complete. The mind keeps working, analyzing, anticipating, predicting. This helps explain why many of these people feel a kind of exhaustion that doesn't go away with vacations or breaks. The weariness doesn't come only from what they do, but from how they function, from carrying internal responsibility all the time. What makes this more complex is that this way of functioning is often invisible. There's no obvious collapse, no clear crisis, just a persistent sense of always holding something together, something that, if let go, might cause problems, even when there's no concrete evidence of that. Over time, this feeling starts to seem normal. The person gets used to it. They come to believe it's the price of living well. That relaxing too much is naive. That fully trusting is dangerous. But this balance is fragile. It requires constant effort, and at some point it begins to limit the experience of being present without calculation. That's when the question shifts. It's no longer what could still go wrong, but what am I not living because I'm always prepared for the worst? This question doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up in small moments, in an opportunity declined, in a relationship that never deepens, in a rest that never fully arrives. And when it begins to surface, something important is happening. At some point, this way of living starts to produce an unexpected effect. The person stops noticing how much they're carrying, not because the weight has lessened, but because it has become the norm. What was once an exception turns into a baseline. Constant effort starts to feel normal. This shows up subtly, in difficulty enjoying pleasure without guilt, in good moments that don't last very long because something inside is already anticipating the fall, in a strange inability to fully celebrate without immediately thinking about the future cost. These people are usually very aware of what could go wrong, and far less aware of how much mental space that awareness takes up. Preventive thinking, which once served as protection, begins to consume energy even when there's no concrete threat. It's as if the mind never fully shuts off. In relationships, this creates a quiet dynamic. The person cares but measures, gets involved but calculates, offers presence but keeps reserves, not because there's a lack of affection, but because there's a fear of becoming too emotionally dependent. Because at some point in their history, depending meant being overly exposed. This constant caution can be mistaken for emotional maturity, and often it's socially reinforced. People like this are seen as responsible, grounded, reliable, and they learn to uphold that role, even when it starts to cost them internally. The problem is that living in constant anticipation of impact reduces the capacity to be surprised. Spontaneity shrinks. Risk is avoided even when it's necessary for growth. The person starts choosing safety over experience, not because they want less from life, but because they learn to protect what they already have. This pattern also affects the relationship with desire itself. To desire something deeply means accepting the possibility of loss, and for those who've lived through difficult experiences, that possibility carries more weight. Desire becomes moderated, adjusted, made reasonable. Big dreams are scaled down before they're ever attempted. Over time, a strange sense of distance emerges between the life the person is living and the life they could be living. Not an explosive frustration, but a low-grade discomfort, a sense that something is being held back all the time. This restraint isn't conscious. It happens before decision, before action, even before thought. It's the body saying, be careful, even when the situation doesn't call for caution. Another important effect is difficulty trusting emotional rest. To relax requires believing that nothing urgent is about to happen. For someone who's lived through instability, that belief doesn't come automatically. Rest feels like a risky pause, something that could be costly if it lasts too long. That's why these people tend to stay busy. Not necessarily productive, but active. Constant movement creates a sense of control. Being still amplifies internal awareness, and that awareness can bring up emotions that were postponed for later. What's rarely acknowledged is that this way of functioning isn't a flaw. It's adaptive competence. It worked. It helped. It protected. The problem arises when it keeps operating in contexts that no longer require the same level of alertness. At that point, adaptation starts to become limitation. The person may sense that something isn't quite right, but can't pinpoint what. There's no clear event to point to, no obvious decision to change, just an accumulated weariness. That's when many people begin to wonder why they feel tired even when life is relatively stable, why relationships seem to require so much effort, why pleasure comes mixed with tension, why trust never feels simple. These questions don't come from weakness, they come from strength sustained for too long. And understanding that shifts the focus of the conversation. It's not about getting over the past, it's about recognizing that certain survival strategies need to be revised when the context changes, because what helps someone get through a hard phase can prevent them from fully inhabiting the next one. That recognition doesn't solve everything, but it opens a new possibility, slowly choosing where protection is still necessary and where rest is finally allowed. That's where reflection begins to turn into something more practical. Not a quick fix, but a shift in internal posture. There comes a point when this way of functioning starts asking to be reconsidered. The person realizes they're still reacting as if they were in the middle of something difficult, even when life no longer demands the same level of resistance. This recognition doesn't arrive with immediate clarity. It's not an now I understand everything moment. It feels more like the sense that something is slightly out of place, a kind of fatigue that can't be explained only by what one does, a difficulty enjoying what has already been achieved, a strange feeling of always being prepared for an impact that never actually comes. The central issue is that difficult experiences teach survival, not rest. They train the body and mind to deal with scarcity, instability, and loss of control, and that training works. The problem begins when it keeps operating in contexts that are no longer threatening but full of possibility. At this stage, protecting oneself all the time starts to cost more than taking small risks. Constant control turns into a quiet prison. Excessive caution limits simple movement, and the person begins to realize they're living a life that is functional but narrow. Not narrow in the sense of small, narrow in the sense of constrained. This is where a difficult choice appears, to keep functioning the way one always has, or to experiment with a different internal rhythm. A rhythm that's less defensive, less anticipatory, more present. That choice doesn't happen all at once. It shows up in small gestures, allowing oneself not to know everything, accepting help without feeling weak, staying in a relationship even when the initial impulse is to pull back, resting without turning it into guilt. These gestures seem simple, but they're not. For someone who learned to stay strong at all times, lowering their guard requires relearning. It requires trusting something that wasn't guaranteed in the past. The idea that now things might be different. And here's a delicate point. This isn't about denying what was lived, nor about forcing optimism. It's about recognizing that the context has changed, and that internal functioning needs to slowly adjust as well. People who've been through hard things don't need to become stronger. They already are. What they often need is to become more flexible, to allow strength not to be used all the time, to learn that resting isn't giving up, that trusting isn't naive, that depending at certain moments is human. This process comes with discomfort. At first, relaxing feels wrong. The body doesn't recognize safety as real. The mind keeps scanning for danger, but with repetition and awareness, something begins to shift. Vigilance eases slightly. Pleasure stops being immediately followed by fear. The future is no longer only something to control, but something to live. Small experiences can be enjoyed without constant calculation. None of this erases the past, but it changes the place the past occupies. What once dictated every decision becomes a reference, not an absolute director. The difficult experience stops being the only filter and becomes part of a larger story, broader and less restrictive. This is a quiet movement, almost invisible from the outside, but deeply transformative on the inside. Instead of asking, how do I endure more? The person starts asking, where can I already let go? Instead of living prepared for the worst, they begin testing the possibility of living open enough. And maybe that's the biggest shift of all, realizing that survival doesn't have to be a permanent way of existing. Some phases of life demand extreme strength. Others ask for something else. They ask for presence. They ask for measured risk. They ask for real rest. Understanding the psychology of people who've been through hard things isn't about romanticizing pain or turning it into identity. It's about recognizing the cost of carrying survival strategies for too long. When that becomes clear, something reorganizes. Honestly, the person remains who they are. They just stop living as if the worst were still about to happen. If you stayed until the end, thank you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you next time.